Welcome to Back on the Stack, a cEDH channel. You asked and we listened. Back on the Stack merch is now available to purchase on our Bonfire site. We have sweatshirts, hoodies, t-shirts, and more. Find the link down below. Also, please don't forget about Patreon. Subscribers to our Grand Slam tier will receive a playmat for absolutely free. Now, let's get right into it and see what decks are being piloted tonight.
Hi, my name is Mike. I play cEDH and I do the design work for Playing with Power MTG on YouTube. I also paint altars under the name Saad Robot Altars. Today I'm playing Kinnan, Bond or Prodigy. This is a mid-range deck. It can play fast or slow depending on the pod, and the deck aims to create a ton of mana through Kinnan's ability and then win through infinite mana into Kinnan activations. I kept my opening hand because it makes a bunch of mana quickly. It can stall the game out with Wandering Archaic until I'm able to set up my Kinnan activations. I chose to mulligan the Worldly Tutor because I am bad at Magic.
What's up guys, Spuki here. We're playing Pantlaza today. This is a Naya tempo control deck. We kept a hand that has a infinite combo in its opener with a little bit of disruption with Dauntless Dismantler and possibly being able to Eldritch the Dauntless into a Dockside to help solidify that combo in hand. Let's see how this goes.
Tonight I'm piloting my Ob Nixilis deck again. It wins through Dockside loops with Cloudstone Curio or Chthonian Nightmare, or also with backup lines through Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Walking Ballista. I decided to keep my mole to 6 because it was able to tutor for Dockside into my hand for a turn 2 if the count is high enough. Plus, I have half a win con in hand already, so I figured I would just run with it.
Hey everybody, it's Eli, and tonight I'm piloting Najeela. This is a 5-color good stuff deck, seeks to use Ad Nauseam, Underworld Breach, Thassa's Oracle, but also includes some spicy creature combos like Shatterfang and Horn Soul Trader. I kept my opening hand to turn 2 Najeela in 4th seat with some interaction and a tutor. We'll see what we can do with this.
With introductions out of the way, Mike will kick us off. He draws and plays Wooded Foothills as land for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches up Tropical Island to the battlefield. He casts Soul Ring. He casts Mox Opal. He passes. Spuki draws and plays Flooded Strand for turn. He pays a life, sacks it, and fetches up Plateau to the battlefield. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Dauntless Dismantler. He passes. J-Rock draws and shocks in Blood Crypt for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. It resolves and he tutors a card to the top of the library, loses 2 life, and passes the turn. Eli draws and plays Command Tower for turn. He casts Delighted Halfling. He passes. Mike draws and plays Yavimaya Coast for turn. He casts his commander, Kinnan. He passes. In his upkeep, Spuki wins his crypt roll. He draws and plays City of Brass for turn. He moves to combat and swings Dauntless at J-Rock. He takes 1 damage. Spuki then passes the turn. J-Rock draws and plays Phyrexian Tower for turn. He casts Talisman of Indulgence, which comes into play tapped due to Dauntless Dismantler. He passes. Eli draws and plays Exotic Orchard. He casts Mana Crypt, which comes in tapped. He casts his commander, Najeela, the Blade Blossom. He passes the turn. Mike draws and casts Wandering Archaic. He moves to combat and swings Kinnan at J-Rock. He takes 2 damage. Mike then passes the turn. In his upkeep, Spuki wins his crypt roll. He draws and plays Savannah for turn. He casts his commander, Pantlaza, Sun Favored. It ETBs and he discovers 4. He exiles Pyroblast. He chooses to cast the Pyroblast without paying its mana cost, targeting Kinnan. In response, Mike pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep. It resolves and counters Pyroblast. Spuki moves to combat and swings Dauntless at J-Rock. He takes 1, and then Spuki passes the turn. J-Rock draws and plays Ancient Tomb as land for turn. He casts his commander, Ob Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. He then passes. In his upkeep, Eli loses his crypt roll. He draws and plays Misty Rainforest for turn. He taps it and pays a life in an attempt to fetch, but Ob triggers and J-Rock exiles Snuff Out from the top of his library and adds a +1/+1 counter to Ob. Then Eli fetches up Tundra to the battlefield. Eli casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing his Delighted Halfling as an additional cost. Wandering Archaic triggers and he pays. It resolves and Eli tutors a card to hand. He casts Mystic Remora. It resolves and Eli passes the turn. Mike draws and plays a basic island for turn. He pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It ETBs and he has it become a copy of Ob Nixilis. He passes. In his upkeep, Spuki loses his crypt roll. He draws and taps City of Brass to float a green. Both Obs trigger. Mike exiles Seedborn Muse from the top of his library, and J-Rock exiles Defense Grid. Then Spuki casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2. Mystic Remora triggers and Eli draws. It ETBs and he gives it to Eli to defend. Then Spuki tutors Dockside Extortionist to the battlefield. It ETBs and he creates 6 treasure tokens. He casts Twin Flame, targeting his Dockside. Wandering Archaic and Fish both trigger. He pays for Archaic and Eli draws from Fish. It resolves and he creates 6 more treasure tokens. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dauntless Dismantler as an additional cost. Wandering Archaic and Fish both trigger and he pays for neither. Mike's copy of the spell resolves first, and he tutors Glenalindra Archmage to the battlefield. Then Eli draws from Fish. With the original copy of Eldritch Evolution on the stack, Mike activates Glenalindra's ability by paying a blue and sacrificing it to counter the spell. Glenalindra's Persist ability triggers, and the creature is returned to the battlefield with a neg1 counter on it. Spuki then passes the turn. J-Rock draws and plays a basic swamp for turn. He casts Defense Grid from exile. Fish triggers and Eli draws. In response, Mike activates Glenalindra's ability again, paying a blue and sacrificing it to counter the D-Grid. J-Rock casts Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Fish triggers and Eli draws. J-Rock then casts Walking Ballista where X equals 0. It resolves and Walking Ballista is destroyed when state-based actions check and find that it has a toughness of 0. J-Rock then activates Agatha's Soul Cauldron, targeting to exile the Walking Ballista in his graveyard. But in response, Eli casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Kinnan. Wandering Archaic triggers and he doesn't pay. Mike's copy resolves first and he has it target J-Rock's Ob. In response, J-Rock casts Deadly Rollick, targeting Spuki's Dockside. Wandering Archaic and Fish both trigger and he doesn't pay. Mike copies the spell and targets Najeela. It's moved to the command zone and Eli draws from Fish. Then the original Rollick resolves and exiles Dockside. Then Mike's copy of Swords resolves and exiles J-Rock's Ob. Then the original Swords resolves and exiles Kinnan. Then Agatha's Soul Cauldron resolves and exiles Walking Ballista. J-Rock casts Snuff Out for its alternative casting cost, paying 4 life, and targeting Wandering Archaic. Archaic and Fish both trigger and he doesn't pay. Mike's copy of Snuff Out goes on the stack first and he has it targeting Pantlaza. In response, Spuki channels Touch the Spirit Realm, targeting his Pantlaza. It resolves and Pantlaza is exiled until the beginning of the next end step. The copy of Snuff Out then fizzles. Eli then draws from Fish. With the original copy on the stack, Mike casts March of Swirling Mist, targeting his Wandering Archaic. Fish triggers and Eli draws. Archaic is then phased out. J-Rock moves to his end step and Touch the Spirit Realm triggers, returning Pantlaza to the battlefield. It ETBs and Spuki discovers 4. He shows Chord of Calling and puts it to his hand. The turn then moves to Eli. In his upkeep, Eli loses his Crypt Roll. He sacrifices his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Grand Abolisher. In response, Spuki casts Chord of Calling, where X equals 2. It resolves and he tutors his own Grand Abolisher to the battlefield. Eli then casts Demonic Tutor. It resolves and he tutors a card to hand. He casts Dockside. It ETBs and he creates 6 treasure tokens. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. He casts Esper Sentinel. Eli then passes the turn. In his upkeep, Mike's Wandering Archaic phases back in. He draws and immediately recasts Kinnan. He moves to combat and swings his copy of Ob at Eli. He declares no blocks and takes the damage. Mike then passes the turn. In his upkeep, Spuki loses his Crypt Roll. He draws and casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Pantlaza. Archaic and Esper both trigger. He pays for Archaic by tapping 2 lands, one of which is City of Brass. Mike's copy of Ob triggers and he exiles Mirage Mirror. Then Eli draws from Esper. Heat Shimmer then resolves and creates a copy of Pantlaza. The copy is then sacrificed to the Legend Rule. Because the original Pantlaza saw a Dinosaur ETB, Spuki gets 2 Discover 4 triggers. He exiles Fanatic of Ronus and casts it for free. With the second trigger, he exiles and casts Cutsil. He moves to combat and declares Pantlaza at Eli. Eli takes the damage and Spuki then passes the turn. J-Rock draws and immediately casts Wheel of Fortune. Archaic and Esper both trigger. J-Rock pays for neither of them. Mike chooses not to copy the spell and Eli draws from Esper. In response, Eli casts Silence. Archaic triggers and Eli does not pay. Mike chooses to copy Silence and it goes on the stack first. It resolves and with the original copy on the stack, Mike casts Snap, targeting Eli's Abolisher. Esper triggers and Eli draws. Abolisher is then bounced to Eli's hand and the original copy of Silence resolves. Then Wheel resolves. Everyone discards their hand and draws a fresh 7. Notably, Spuki discards Squee the Immortal. J-Rock plays Reflecting Pool for turn and then passes. In his upkeep, Eli loses his Crypt Roll. He draws and plays Bloodstained Mire for turn. He casts Mana Vault. He activates Wishclaw, giving it to J-Rock. It resolves and he tutors a card to hand. He casts Underworld Breach. In response, J-Rock activates Agatha's Soul Cauldron, targeting Grand Abolisher in Eli's graveyard. Breach then resolves. Eli casts Silence. Wandering Archaic triggers and Eli pays. In response, Spuki casts Flare of Duplication, sacrificing Pantlaza as an alternative cost. Archaic and Esper both trigger and he doesn't pay. Mike chooses to copy the Flare of Duplication, copying the Silence. In response, Eli casts Flusterstorm, with 4 copies targeting Mike's copy and 1 targeting the original Flare of Duplication. Archaic triggers and Eli pays. Flusterstorm then successfully counters both spells. Eli then draws from his delayed Esper trigger, and with the original copy of Silence on the stack, Mike channels Otawara, targeting Underworld Breach. It resolves and bounces Breach back to Eli's hand. With Silence back on the stack, J-Rock casts Tragic Slip, targeting Kinnan. Archaic and Esper both trigger, and he pays for Esper. Then Mike copies Tragic Slip, targeting Grand Abolisher, giving it -13, -13. Then the original copy resolves, also killing Kinnan. Then Silence finally resolves. Eli taps Bloodstained Mire, pays a life and attempts to fetch, and Mike's copy of Ob triggers. He exiles Finhorn Elves. Then Eli fetches up Underground Sea to the battlefield. Completely out of gas, he decides to pass the turn. Mike draws and plays Treasure Vault for turn. He casts Mystic Remora. Esper triggers and he pays. He casts Delighted Halfling. He casts Chrome Mox. It ETBs and he imprints Thorn Mammoth. He casts Mirage Mirror. He moves to combat and swings his copy of Ob at Eli. Eli takes the damage and Mike passes the turn. In his upkeep, Spuki wins his Crypt roll. He draws and plays Misty Rainforest for turn. He taps it, pays a life, and attempts to fetch. Mike's copy of Ob triggers and he exiles Rejuvenating Springs. Then Spuki fetches up Taiga to the battlefield. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It ETBs and he tutors Esper Sentinel to hand. He casts Birthing Pod. Fish and Esper both trigger and Mike and Eli both draw. Spuki taps his City of Brass to float a green. Ob triggers and Mike exiles Baseja, who endures, off the top of his library. Spuki then pays 2 life to activate Birthing Pod, sacrificing Fanatic of Ronus as additional cost. He tutors Aven Mind Sensor to the battlefield. He moves to combat and swings Kutzel at J-Rock. He takes the damage, and Spuki passes the turn. J-Rock draws and casts Keteric Parasite. Knowing there's an Aven Mind Sensor on board, he still chooses to activate Wishclaw, knowing that with the current board state, this is likely his last attempt. The board politics to argue over who should be the recipient of the Wishclaw, and Mike states that he will not activate it if J-Rock gives it to him, so he does. He looks at the top 4 and puts 1 to hand. He decides to move through phases and pass, but in response, feeling the same board pressure, Eli casts Mystical Tutor. Fish and Archaic both trigger, and Eli pays for neither. Mike draws through Fish and then copies Mystical Tutor, looking at the top 4, failing to find. Then Eli looks at his top 4 and also fails to find. The turn then moves to Eli. In his upkeep, Eli loses his Crypt roll. He loses 1 from the vault in his draw step. Ob triggers and Mike exiles Ancient Tomb from the top of his library. Eli plays Tropical Island for turn. He casts Mox Opal. Fish triggers and Mike draws. Eli casts Grim Hireling. He moves to combat and swings Esper and Dockside at J-Rock. He takes the damage. Grim Hireling triggers and Eli creates 2 treasure tokens. He activates Grim Hireling, sacrificing 3 treasures to give Ranger Captain -3, -3. In response, Spuki activates Ranger Captain's ability, sacrificing it. Eli then moves through phases and passes. In his upkeep, Mike pays for Fish. He draws and plays Ancient Tomb for turn. He casts Dozin, the Falling Leaf. He casts a mini Cyclonic Rift, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Esper triggers and Eli draws. Then Aven is bounced back to Spuki's hand. Mike casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2. He tutors Flesh Duplicate to the battlefield. It ETBs and he has it become a copy of Dockside. It ETBs and he creates 8 treasure tokens. He casts Finale of Devastation, where X equals 6. He tutors Consecrated Sphinx to the battlefield. He moves to combat and swings Wandering Archaic at J-Rock and Ob at Eli. They both declare no blocks, and Eli is eliminated from combat damage. Mike passes the turn. In his upkeep, Spuki wins his Crypt roll. He draws and Con Sphinx triggers. Mike draws 2. Spuki plays Wooded Foothills for turn. He taps it, pays a life, and attempts to fetch, and Ob triggers. Mike exiles Arcane Signet. Spuki then tutors Temple Garden, shocking it in. He casts Tinderwall. He sacrifices it and adds 2 red to his pool. He recasts his commander, Pantlaza. He holds priority and taps a City of Brass to float a white. Ob triggers and Mike exiles Llanowar Elves. Spuki casts Enlighten Tutor. Fish and Archaic both trigger, Spuki pays for neither. Mike chooses to not copy and draws from Fish. Then Spuki tutors Food Chain to the top of his library. Pantlaza then ETBs and he exiles the Food Chain, casting it for free. With the Food Chain on the stack, J-Rock is reminded that he can exile Spuki's Ranger Captain with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and then sack his Parasite to lock out Spuki from non-creature spells. Knowing he is probably too late to that realization to help out, he decides to do it anyway. Ranger Captain's ability then resolves. Spuki sacrifices Pantlaza to Food Chain. He casts Squee from his graveyard. He presents a loop of creating infinite creature mana through Food Chain and Squee. He casts Pantlaza and discovers 4. He continues this process over and over until he has put almost all of his creatures onto the battlefield, non-creatures, non-lands to hand, and leaving land cards in his graveyard. He casts Skyclave Apparition and exiles Mike's Dozin. He casts Sowing Microspawn and puts Gaia's Cradle into play. He casts Eternal Witness. It ETBs and he returns Pyroblast to hand. He then taps his Cradle and uses some of the mana to activate Emil the Blessed to flicker Felidar Guardian. It ETBs and he untaps Cradle. He presents a loop of creating infinite green mana by untapping Cradle over and over with Felidar Guardian and Emil. He then flickers all of his lands. He flickers Skyclave over and over and exiles all opponents' non-land permanents with CMC 4 or less. He flickers Eternal Witness and brings back Flare of Duplication and Dualcaster Mage to hand. He shapes a hand of 7 and passes the turn. In J-Rock's upkeep, Spuki presents the same loop with Cradle, Emil, and Felidar to create infinite green mana, then switching to his other lands to produce infinite Naya mana. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting an opponent's face. He then flickers Eternal Witness, bringing Bolt back to hand. He presents a loop of casting Bolt and returning it to hand to cast it over and over until all of his opponents are dead, and Spuki wins the game. That was a long, grindy game with a ton of interaction. Actual gameplay took over 2 hours, and players often found themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place trying to determine the optimum play. In the end, Spuki once again shows us why his Pantlaza homebrew was good enough to qualify him for the Top Deck Invitationals. The group wants to thank Mike Saad for taking time out of his schedule to jam some games with us. We encourage you to go look at some of his amazing altar work. Feel free to check out the deck links listed below, and we will see you back on the stack.